Hi, my name is Andrew Bell. I'm a criminal justice data analyst at the Oklahoma Policy Institute. I have been for a couple of years now. Recently, I was asked to present an interim study up at the Capitol about diversion courts. Diversion courts are kind of a newer, growing sort of policy area in the criminal justice space. Basically, the concept of a diversion court, or you might have heard them called alternative courts, or you might have heard specific references to drug court or things like that. The idea of these courts is that when people go into the criminal justice system and when they have charges filed against them, often there are things involved in their case or in their personal life or things like that that are the root cause of whatever is bringing them to court, right? And that is usually something like substance abuse issues that are not able to be treated or not being treated for whatever reason, housing access issues, mental health issues that are not being treated or that the person cannot afford to have treated. And so the idea of these courts is that if we can address those specific things and then get them out of the criminal justice system without having a felony conviction or something like that, or without having these charges on their record, then that can help them get back on their feet and reestablish their life in a much more straightforward and easy way than it otherwise would be through the normal court system. So these are a newish growing policy area that is meant to help get people through the system and get these charges off of their record while still addressing the actual fundamental problem in their life or in that case. And so it's a very good thing. And I'm really excited about diversion courts and the growth of these programs. But one of the aspects that this interim study was looking at for these diversion courts was, how are we tracking what they're doing? How are we able to look at data from around the state, from all these different diversion programs? How are we able to actually see what's going on, what's working, what's not working, and so on and so forth? So that's what I was there to talk about at this interim study. The sort of downside of the newness of these programs and of the fact that they're springing up all around the state, in all the different districts. There's 77 district courts in Oklahoma. Each one of those 77 districts has their own diversion court programs. In the county of Oklahoma, there's, I think, a dozen plus different diversion courts. And these new programs are coming up all the time, and they're not being implemented from the top down, which means that the legislature has not, created these directly. The legislature has done a lot of work in this area to help enable these programs, but they're not actually going in and creating each individual one and putting them into a holistic system. And that means that we have no data that tracks the entire diversion court system. We have no way to track, for example, how things like State Question 780 might have affected these programs, because we're not collecting the data in a statewide holistic manner. And that's usually where Oklahoma Policy comes in, because we are able to use our court data that we've scraped from the Oklahoma State Court Network website and sort of fill that gap and draw the data in from all the various places where it's being collected to where it can then be used for stakeholders to make better decisions. So that's what I was there to present at this interim study. What are the challenges that are involved in tracking diversion court participation using the OSCN website? And how can we maybe move past those limitations in order to see what's going on a little more holistically in our diversion courts? So before I get into that, just to sort of set the table here, I want to go through how OSCN collects data, how Open Justice collects data from OSCN, and sort of what that process looks like. So I've got this little diagram here. It's not much of a diagram. It's mostly just letters and a couple of arrows. But as it shows, we go straight to the OSCN website. This is what the OSCN website looks like. This is what a case looks like on the OSCN website. And what our scraper does that we've built, it's a little piece of software. It just goes on this website every day. It looks for new cases, and it takes all of this information that you can see up on the screen, and it puts it into our database in a what we would call a tidy format or a clean format. And clean is one of my three buzzwords for this presentation: clean, consistent, and complete. That's what we want our data to be on OSCN, because when it is not clean, consistent, and complete, we cannot trust the conclusions that we draw from it. It's I think I made the analogy. It's like building a house on a poor foundation. If your data is not of high quality, if it's not capturing the entire thing that you're wanting to talk about or learn about, you cannot trust the data to be the source of any conclusions or analysis that you do. It's not trustworthy. And so the issues right now with the diversion court data on OSCN are exactly that. It is not complete, consistent, and clear, and therefore we're not able to do a lot of the same kind of analysis that we've been able to do on this court data more broadly. So complete, consistent, and clear. Those are our buzzwords. And this is basically how the scraper works. So next, I've got a couple of examples here of what the OSCN website looks like in some more specific cases. This is sort of how we would track diversion court participation if we were able to. As you can see on this slide here, each case includes the information about what the case's charges were, information about the defendant, information about the judges and the attorneys at play and things like that. And then below that basic information, you can see the docket of each case, which has a listing of basically every time something happens in a case. Did the person have a warrant issued because they failed to appear in court? That'll be in the docket. Did someone have a judgment entered in their case? Did the verdict come down? That'll be entered on their docket. So ideally, in a sort of perfect world, there would be a docket item that says this person participated in a diversion court. Here's exactly how they got on the diversion court. Here's exactly which diversion court it was. Here's exactly what happened in the outcome. Did they complete the diversion court programming? Did they unsuccessfully finish the program and sort of go back into the normal court system? What happened, right? And the problem right now with this diversion court stuff is that what happened in the data, in the docket items and things like that, it is not complete, consistent, and clear. That is the issue. There are a couple of different ways, in fact, a myriad of different ways that this information will show up on the OSCN site, depending on the specific circumstances of their case. So I've got this other slide here, just as one last example of how OSCN information can look very different depending on the circumstances of what's going on. These three cases that these screenshots are from are three different cases. Two are Oklahoma County felonies. The third one is a Cleveland County misdemeanor. And so you can see each one of these three items from the docket is an instance where someone is applying for the indigent defense system. So they're unable to afford an attorney. They're using their constitutional right to an attorney, right? That's what that means. And you can see on this slide that it actually does cost money to use your constitutional rights in Oklahoma. There's a fee associated with applying for indigent defense. And in these last two screenshots specifically, I want to draw attention to this because it's sort of what I'm talking about here. This indigent defense system in Cleveland County is actually different than one in Oklahoma County. Oklahoma and Tulsa have their own indigent defense systems that actually cost slightly less when you use them. So the difference between these two items in the docket are you can see the difference in the code here. There's an AIDS code on this one docket item, and then there's an AIDS 1 code on the other docket item. The first one is from Oklahoma County. The second one is from Cleveland County. And the only reason those are different at all, because they denote the exact same thing happening, right? The reason they're different is because Oklahoma County and Tulsa County have separate indigent defense systems that are their own thing because they have such a higher volume of defendants coming through those particular courts. So it's still an application for indigent defense. It's just coded slightly differently on OSCN. And when we do analysis of, for example, applications for indigent defense at Oklahoma Policy, we're able to do that because this data, while it isn't completely consistent, it's consistent in a way that we can predict and understand. There's really only these two codes. There's this APLI one as well, but that one is not present in, I think, like 99% of these instances. So because that this information is complete, clear, and consistent enough, and because we understand the ways in which it is not complete, clear, and consistent, that means that we can feel comfortable doing data analysis on that specific topic. And we can trust the conclusions that we draw from that analysis. On the other hand, when it comes to the diversion court participation in particular, that information is not quite clear, consistent, and complete enough for us to trust it. And here I have some more screenshots. These are from cases that did end up participating in diversion court. You can see on OSCN when a case has participated in diversion court. You can kind of tell just by reading through the case page here. And here's some examples. You can see that on the docket, sometimes it's listed. You can see there are a couple different places in these particular cases where it's been listed where there will be a docket item for when someone pleads into one of these diversion courts. You can see on this one on the right, the person pled in there, and it's under the docket item CTFREE, which is the plea. You can see in the bottom left, sometimes it's not denoted there in the docket. Sometimes it's denoted up here on this events table, which is on every case as well. But the thing I'm trying to show here is that it's not reported consistently. The place that it shows up on the website is different depending on what county we're in, which diversion court we're talking about, how the person entered diversion court in some cases, and the specific circumstances of their participation. So the end result is that when we go through our data, our final data in our database that's been collected by our scraper, and if we were to say, show me every case where someone has in their events some indication of participation in diversion court. If we did that, we would only be getting a small chunk of the reality, right? We would only be seeing the cases where it was reported in that particular way. And we could say, let's look at another way. Let's look at everyone who has some indication in their docket items. And that would get us another chunk. But the problem is that there's so many different diversion court programs, and they're popping up all of the time in these other districts. And there's no central repository for how they're going to collect data and what data they're going to collect and where they're going to send it once it's collected. That just doesn't exist yet. There's some beginnings of it. I know the Department of Mental Health has started to sort of aggregate some of the drug court information that's coming in from across the state. But right now, if someone came to me and said, I need court data specifically about Oklahoma County diversion courts or something like that, I would just point them to the Oklahoma diversion court people. Because right now, those are the people who know what's going on with that diversion court. Same thing. If someone asked me about Tulsa, I would send them to the Tulsa diversion court people. Someone asked me about Adair County, I'd send them there. It's all atomized. It's all siloed off. It's all not talking to each other, all of these data sources. And that's something that at Oklahoma Policy we talk about all the time is we need to get our data sources in the state talking to each other so that we can actually know what's going on in our criminal justice system. Right now, with the way that this system is set up, it's very hard even to answer questions like how many Oklahomans are in diversion court right now. It's kind of hard to say. We'd have to go to every individual diversion court and figure that out and add them all up. And that would be an inordinate amount of work. So the value here and the value that OK Policy can provide is if we can get all of this stuff reported on OSCN in a consistent way, or even just reported to the Department of Mental Health or something like that in a consistent way, then we could do the same kind of holistic statewide analysis of what's going on with our diversion courts that we can't do with the current data. And so for example of how that could be helpful, when State Question 780 passed, there was part of that language was that the state was going to appropriate money that was saved by that change when they took some things that were felonies and made them misdemeanors, basically. That's going to save some money because we're not going to be putting as many people in jail for as long. And so that money was supposed to go to various things like education. But the problem was that because this stuff is so hard to figure out and because it's so hard to find holistic statewide information like this, the legislature couldn't figure out how many people were affected by State Question 780. Seems like it should be a pretty straightforward question, but it was hard to find because this court data is so messy. And so what we were able to do was go through this court data and see how many cases had charges that would have been affected by State Question 780. And then we could see how many of those cases got filed since 780 passed, and then that allowed us to estimate how much money was saved. And so here, at this interim study, there were some concerns brought up about State Question 780 and its effects on the diversion courts. There were some people, I think the Tulsa people were saying that it made participation go down in their observation, and then the Oklahoma County people were saying it did not for them. So there's some confusion between these different diversion courts. It's not really clear what's going on. So if we had this kind of statewide data and it was all reported well, clear, complete, and consistent, and so on and so forth, then Oklahoma Policy in theory would be able to do that same kind of statewide analysis and say, well, how did 780 affect our diversion courts? Not just in Tulsa County, not just in Oklahoma County, not just in Adair County, not just in the drug courts, not just in the veterans courts, not just in the DUI courts, but in all of them, what happened? And that's the thing that's missing at the moment in my reading. So I have this last possible solution slide, um, which I presented to the legislators at the interim study, um, to give them an idea of how it could be improved in the short term. So, like I said, ideally they would have some sort of consistent documentation on OSCN. I put a few ideas for how that could look and where it could go, in the slides here. But I also do want to point out that it's not really OSCN's fault. It's not the Administrative Office of Court's fault or anything like that. Again, the whole issue here is that our data sources are not talking to each other. They're different data sources. They're not being compiled into a holistic statewide uh, sort of view that we need to do this kind of work. That's the issue here. It's the fracturedness and the siloed offness of our courts generally, and the fact that they don't talk to each other and their data systems don't talk to each other. That is the fault here. And I know that AOC and the court clerks and all of those folks are working really hard to improve OSCN all the time and to add more data onto the and to make the data more consistent and all of that. So we really appreciate all the work they're doing, and we think that in the near future, as these diversion courts continue to grow, we're really hoping that we can get involved in doing some data analysis and helping legislators as they figure out how to make policy around these courts. Because, like I said at the beginning, these are really helpful and really promising when it comes to actually solving the problems that are at the heart of people's criminal involvement with the courts. Because in so many cases, it's not just that someone decided to do a crime because they wanted to do a crime. It's that they have all these other things happening in their life. Lack of access to housing, substance abuse issues that they can't get treated, mental health issues that they can't get treated, all the things that I mentioned before. So actually treating those things and addressing the root of the problem is a great way to get those people back on their feet, but also to prevent crime from happening, right? To make our communities safer, to make sure that there are less victims of crime in the future, right? So I'm really excited about this, about hopefully being able to contribute to the state and to policymakers as they're figuring this stuff out. And I really encourage you all to, if you're watching this, to go look into how these diversion courts are working, especially in your particular district. I know Oklahoma County and Tulsa County probably have the most going on in terms of the number of courts and how involved they are, but these are all over the state. New ones are being made all the time. And I really think it's worth paying attention to. So I would encourage you to do that. I'd encourage you to pay attention to anything we publish if this data ever gets to a place where we can use it. And thank you for your time. I'm happy to have been able to share this with you.